Thank you very much to Nuala for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here on such a wild day outside. It's my first time in Ballina today, which is a great excitement for me. I do, however, feel that maybe I've been, any of you who are familiar with the GAA know that the team that is listed in the programme isn't always the team that shows out in the pitch, and obviously I've been drafted in here as a Kerryman with 3 Galway people in Mayo on my first visit to Ballina. I wonder whether or not I might be in slightly dangerous territory, especially given the weekend that's in it for Kerry playing Mayo this evening in very wet and wild conditions. But I think that after that fabulous talk by Diarmuid, what we're going to be talking about is going to be particularly relevant to both where I'm from in Kerry, but especially to Mayo and to Galway and to places in the west of Ireland for whom that excess of centralisation that Diarmuid talked about has had very real costs, because while Ireland has made enormous strides as a nation over the last 100 years with the 100th anniversary of the state and the decade of centenaries ongoing, for many parts of Ireland that has come with great changes in the geography and the demography of those places. So I mean, the population of the county of Mayo now is smaller than it was at the foundation of the state. The population of the county of Kerry is smaller now than it was at the foundation of the state. And of course, we all know that these places are far, far smaller than they were in the 19th century. But even in the lifetime of the state that we live in now, places on the western seaboard have seen significant population falls during some periods and have never regained those places. And I remember myself leaving Ireland in 2008. I mean, a lot of the stories about emigration and its impact on Western communities that most moved me came from Mayo. Stories of places, that were struggling to field football teams, or only had 16 fellas togging out, couldn't field a women's team or couldn't field junior teams and things like that. Or even the famous incident of, it was at Kilmavee Shamrocks, who did a mock-up 15 of the 15 fellas they would put out if they weren't all living in 15 different countries elsewhere in the world. So there have been great challenges for certain places in the West because of that kind of sucking of power towards the centre that Diarmuid talked about. And what we're going to be talking about in this panel is sort of how, if you feel that the centre doesn't look after you, which is something that I imagine people in Mayo often feel, and certainly down in Kerry we often feel that we want to be a place apart and that we want to sort of make our own way. What can you do about that? How can you take ownership yourselves as communities to say, well, if it's not going to come from the centre and if we're not going to be trusted with the sort of responsibility for our own local affairs and given the power over our local affairs to do the things that we want with it, well, what can we do sort of from the ground up underneath that? And we're going to be talking with three Galwegians who have done that and been part of that in different ways. And I'm going to talk to each of them in turn about their own work on sort of building community, and then we'll talk a little bit together at the end of that about the sort of commonalities and similarities and the ways that communities can kind of take ownership of their own affairs. And I thought that was something really interesting that Diarmuid said about Sean McEntee. If I could start with you, Pat, you're a lecturer in geography in NUIG, and you're very concerned, a lot of your work is concerned with issues of excess centralisation. And Diarmuid talked about that quote from Sean McEntee about the idea that like the spirit of local government can't be sort of enforced by an act of the Oireachtas. It kind of has to come from the people, in the sense that local government has to have some amount of buy-in and investment. And you've been involved in a project in Galway in Moycullen called Moycullen 2030 about a community's kind of from the ground up giving an idea of where it wants to go. And I wonder if you could just explain to us first what the project was all about.
Thanks very much, Christopher. So probably back in June of 2019, we started with this project, which was funded by the Irish Research Council. So I went to the Irish Research Council with this pretty simple idea that if anyone's aware of local area planning, it's a practice carried out. I won't look too long at Peter Hines over there. It's a practice carried out in the main by county councils, where they go around and they pick particular municipal areas with over 1,500 people, and they draw up these plans. Probably it would be fair to call them at the very least dry, but they're, in the main statistical exercises. You have X% of the population, therefore you will only get Y% of the resources. And look, this is in reference to lots of what Diarmuid talked about. This is filtering down from the top It's a case of, under-resourced to under-resourced to further under-resourced. So I went to the Irish Research Council with the pretty simple idea of, let's just forget about strictures when that these kind of county councils have to abide by. And let's collectively imagine a place. Just forget about everything. Everything's open for discussion. And let's start that conversation. And that's what we did in June of 2019. And it was very much guided by the principles of bottom-up. So we started off in the classrooms of the local school in Moycullen. And we went in on the last week of school, actually, which I would never recommend that anybody goes into a classroom and expects students to pay attention on the last week of school. But we bought iPads, so they did pay attention to that. But it was between identifying key kind of stakeholders in the village, and these weren't all the traditional stakeholders. I mean, councillors, and we do have councillors, and we have good councillors in the main in Moycullen and the surrounding area. But, it was more so about, shall we say, people that were, living and working in the village, that had worked there, that had made the village. It was to do with representatives of the GAA. It was to do with representatives of active retirement. And through a process, which took some time, we identified the people, sat down and talked to them individually, grew that then through focus groups, grew that again through process of surveying, both face-to-face and online. We developed an app which people could use to kind of collectively imagine the place through augmented reality, and really just fired the geographical imaginary of people and get them actively involved in the authorship of their place.
Yeah. And what kind of, Moycullen is quite a small place, and what kind of participation rate did you get? Because when we think about, people participating in elections or people participating in local government is not the most exciting part for a lot of people of politics or anything like that. What kind of participation rate were you able to achieve by spreading the sort of the wings of the project in all different directions in the community?
Well, it was pretty good. I went to the Irish Research Council and I said we would be happy with 20% of the population. Now, Moycullen has a population of about 1,600-1,700 in 2016, and we ended up with 50% participation. 20% as a guideline in social science is usually what you take as saying you're pretty confident now that you have what more or less everybody is thinking. But it grew, and it really grew because people wanted to be part of it, I also live in Moycullen, so I was very conscious I didn't want to leave people out of it, and my wife, who's from Moycullen, made sure that I didn't leave. So either way, beyond that, it was a genuine, it was like asking the question that people had waited to be asked, what do you want your place to look like? What do you think your place needs? Because, and we've heard this already, we feel that our place is kind of predetermined, that our notions of planning in Ireland tend to be, we deal in the negative, something is done and then, or something's proposed and we object, or something's done and we give out about it. What about just starting to say, well, let's just do this together? Yeah. And when people had those questions, people gave a lot of time.
So what is it that when you ask the question broadly and say, what do you want Moycullen to look like in 2030? What are the things you want to prioritise, rather than saying, do you have a problem with this bypass, or do you have a problem with this greenway, or do you have a problem with this development? What were the things that people, because if you have more than half the community actively participating, you have a pretty good idea of the things that people think are important.
Yes.
What were the things that they wanted prioritised?
Community. It's quite simply community. And everybody does. One of the things that I've written about this project is that, the thing about people-centered planning is that people participating in planning tend to put people at the center of planning. So by its very nature becomes people-centric. So abounded was this pride in community as it existed in Moycullen, but fear for future development, because we know that Moycullen is a satellite town of Galway City. It is, regardless of any planning, it is going to grow, and it is most likely going to double in size over the next 10 years. So there's a genuine fear over the fact that with that level of growth comes a loss of community. So what we want to do, and what the people of Moycullen wanted to do, was ensure that a future growth ensured that community would remain strong. And so that was really the take-home message. And sure, people were giving out about Johnny not giving up his field, and people were giving out about a bypass that was badly planned, but invariably it all came down to simply that.
So something that's almost a feeling, really, rather than something concrete. It was the thing that people actually found most important. They wanted to live somewhere where they felt they had a sense of place, where they felt that they had a sense of community, like a sense of engagement with their neighbours.
Exactly. So, I mean, really we used, I suppose what it was 3 kind of headings on what came out of this consultation. And I'm struggling to remember the other 2, but anyways, community was number 1, connectivity was number 2, and collaboration was number 3. So community in the sense that, well, people might think community can't, places like this, are community, absolutely. So community can be bricks and mortar, and there is no real bricks and mortar place. There's no community centre in Moycullen. So people did talk about that, but they talked about community in the sense of ensuring that there was greater connectivity between people, that people didn't just end up hopping in their cars going into Galway and, not seeing each other until, something broke and they had to call into their neighbours. But collaboration as well is really important, because people found that once they were part of this kind of process of collective planning, it was something that they wanted to see going forward, and I was struck by that throughout the whole thing is, well, don't just let this stop at the end with a glossy publication. We need to ensure that we keep this collaboration, we keep this conversation going on to ensure that this kind of development.
Has that changed how, do you think, the people in Moycullen, which would of course include yourself, because you're a researcher as well as kind of research subject in the sense that you're someone who lives there, has it changed the way that they and you think about the idea of local government, of the idea that how do we participate in the planning and sort of caring of our own communities?
Yeah, I think, beyond Moycullen, I think there's, the climate imperative, together with Ireland's history over the last 10 years in particular, through a massive crash that was led by property speculation, that we've, begun to look at places differently. So I do think that there is a spatial knowledge out there in the general population that probably wasn't there 10 years ago about how places are made. So, I think that everybody's looking at places differently, and it's true for Moycullen, but I can also imagine that it's true for most of the rest.
And how do you think that interacts? Because if that does change, and people would say, this is great, we enjoyed this process, we thought it was valuable, we don't want it to just stop. But it was a very locally centred process on a specific place. How do you think that something like that can be expanded for lots of places? Because what is good for Moycullen might not necessarily be what's good for Corofin or what's good for Ballyhonus or what's good for how do you create Moycullen 2030 style community engagement around people imagining their places in a way that doesn't see places kind of putting themselves in opposition to each other?
Well, very true, good question. It would start with the Irish Research Council giving me more money. I jest. I would, since the publication of this report, 3 other communities, villages of similar size have gotten in touch with me about activating the same kind of process within their village. And it would have to absolutely be activated individually in each individual place, because what is unique to Moycullen is not unique to other places, and what needs to be ensured over the course of future development in Moycullen does not need to be ensured in other places. So, look, in part, I suppose, one of the rationales for the project was to really question local area planning, and how it's done. And again, I wouldn't be casting dispersions against county council. I understand the kind of restrictions that they work under, but I mean, people don't know local area planning. It's not part of it's not in people's minds when the process happens. The kinds of forms of engagement don't activate people at all. So, I mean, one would hope that the development of the methodology of this kind of engagement could possibly filter through to the local area planning process. And, if anything, that would be a major kind of outcome from this kind of work.
And do you think that there is a way of, because I mean, in some ways, what this came from was a feeling that like the system that is there doesn't allow communities to imagine the way that they want to be. Basically, ideas are presented by developers, or ideas come up from different ways, and then they fit into county development plans or regional development plans or national development plans, and you end up with something that kind of is a hodgepodge of all the things, and people look at their village and they say, well, this isn't what, if I was to, like, this isn't necessarily what we want. It's little bits of things that different people wanted or whatever. Like, how do you relate villages and communities and towns imagining in that way to a structure of local government like a county council, in the sense that like there has to be some form of local government, and in Ireland we are very wedded to our county identities, and I don't see them going anywhere anytime soon. And even if central government doesn't want to cede power to local governments, local government, how do you engage, how do you bring those two things together rather than them being in opposition? So basically, from a Moycullen perspective, what does it look like when the people of Moycullen go to their councillors and say, here is the 2030 Moycullen plan that the people of Moycullen have come up with. These are the things that we want and we think are important. How does that affect, or how should that affect, the way that your councillors and other councillors in the County of Galway think about the decisions that they have to make and the sort of processes that they oversee?
Well, I mean, ideally one would hope directly. Moycullen has a local area plan due, which is also something that we knew in advance of this project. It has a local area plan due for the end of this year. So, in an ideal world, it would quite simply be a submission to the county council to go, well, we understand that you don't have the time, the opportunity to do this kind of collective imagining in the way that we did it, but look, here it's done. Now let's go to central government and let's fight for the resources to be brought down to the local level to enable this truly democratic process. Because I'm not overshooting it, and I don't want overshooting, but there was a genuine feeling that this was actually what democracy is about. And what happened on February the 9th was absolutely an act of democracy, but an act of democracy that's, centuries, if not millennia old, which kind of doesn't seem to fit for the kind of level of knowledge that we have as a population now. I mean, to get a chance to put a tick in a box every 5 years is not enough. We've too much knowledge individually to be only asked to reflect on it once every 5 years.
I suppose there is something interesting there as well about the fact that we actually have seen more innovative forms of democracy at a national level as well over the last few years, with the Citizens' Assembly taking on, issues that were politicians didn't necessarily want to take an immediate stand on, and the citizens taking the lead. Like, is there something there about the idea that like we can have citizens pushing politicians rather than the other way around? Absolutely. If we have people engaged in that way?
Absolutely, and one would hope, and maybe you could even say, embarrassing politicians into action through this kind of, collectively authored document. And so I've been at pains to say I did not write this report. I edited this report. This is the reflection of the village. This is what the village wants. So when you're going to a local politician, you're saying, well, this is not just me. This is a village. This is 1,500 odd votes that you'll be getting, and this is what they want. And the world, as we know, is much more complicated now. It requires this kind of engagement to get to the kind of real things that matter.
And that kind of engagement in lots of different senses. And Tracey, if I could turn to you, I mean, you're a community manager with Bank of Ireland. You're also co-founder of a sort of a social, what do we say, a social enterprise around remote working.
Yeah.
And obviously one of the key issues in terms of communities that often feel ignored or underfunded by an overly centralized state is also an overly centralized economy, in the sense that work is often difficult for people to fit around the kind of lives that they might want to live or the places that they might want to live. So I wonder, just moving on from what we've been talking about in terms of communities, what do you feel about the way that work fits into that, and how can we address that?
The average salary in Monaghan is 22,000. And I did that in a pitch somewhere, and this guy from America was like, first of all, he said, "You mean the starter salary?" And I said, "No, I don't mean the starter salary, I mean the average salary." And then he said, "But you don't have broadband out there anyway." And I was like, okay, no, like this is totally wrong. So I think employment is a fundamental of our communities. And in rural Ireland, they say that you can be self-employed, underemployed, or unemployed. And like that's not good enough. And I think for a long time, when you looked at moving out of Dublin, you had to set up your own business. And there are a ton of supports in that regard. And, digital hubs came into that when startups were kind of booming. And there's 300 plus digital hubs, largely funded by the likes of Enterprise Ireland and local councils and chambers and things like that. But the number of startups weren't filling it. And we need more employment. And how do you go and get more employment? And there was one conversation that I had with a lady from the Burn, which is on the border of where I live. And she had cold emailed somebody on LinkedIn who is a senior executive in a FDI company in Dublin. And she said, "Oh, come here, I've got this package for the Burn. We have a digital hub, so you can work there now, no broadband issues. And when they come down, we'll give them a package for the farmers market, the golf club, whatever we had. Like, it was just extraordinary. She'd do whatever to get the staff down." And he was like, "I don't know why you're talking to me about the Burn." And what I realised in that was that she was right, and she was so passionate, and she needed to be equipped with tools that she could use to effect change. But to try and find the right person in large organisations, get them at the right time and try and sell them on your town is such a hard sell, because they're commercially focused. If you go to the people in the organisations and you say the quality of life, like sense of place for people, they'll do anything to move home. But try and sell that to an employer, that's a much harder thing. Not that it's not possible, it absolutely is. But in order to equip everybody with the ability to make change, not everybody can go into Salesforce and get them, or whatever company, and get them to open up a satellite office in our local towns. And then around that time, I suppose as well, you see when you're working in community, lots of people who are doing stuff in their spare time. And working in community is really hard, because you're on the cold face of stuff. And if anything happens, like Johnny not selling a site or whatever, it's so difficult. Everything's quite personal, and it's social capital all the time. And sometimes things don't go the way you think that they will, and it all comes back on you. And for all the festivals and things like that we're running, we're only patching over problems if employment isn't coming into our area.
Yeah. So how do we, you're involved in something that is specifically targeted this with WeGrow.
Yeah.
Like, rather than sort of convincing the job to come to the place and then the people follow the job, how do you bring the people to the job, as it were?
So the question is, how many jobs are on Valentia Island today, currently open? Does anybody know? Give me an answer. 2. Give me another answer. None. 283 currently open. Okay, so they're in. Oh, I'll try not to get too aggravated. They're currently. So basically, we were in with Western Development Commission actually, and one of the ladies there, a really fascinating economist, said, this teleworking thing was done 20, 30 years ago. This is not new. What is new is that companies are now building their model around a distributed workforce. So you have the likes of GitLab, Buffer, Hotjar, Doist, who'll give you 40 days paid annual leave. They'll give you sick pay. They'll give you parental leave, paternity and maternity, and they'll hire you from wherever you are, anywhere. The problem is that there's no local model for locationless work, and then that's where we fit in. But
how did you come up with a model that makes that work, that connects the people with the work?
Yeah.
Accidentally.
So when we started
often the best
off,
ideas are, I suppose.
Yeah. So when we started off, everyone was talking about remote work, and we just could not see the impact. It sounded like an awful lot of hype. And we got in a WhatsApp group. We ran an event in Tralee, our first one, and we brought together community groups, employers and talent. I said, right, can we just communicate amongst ourselves? And then after that, people were asking us, how do we bring remote work to our area? You can't bring remote work because it's always going to be a bit remote from your community, but we can educate you. So through a platform called ChangeX, it runs kind of like Men's Shed or GIY, and you can equip local leaders with all of the information that they need to educate their local communities. So we take all the dispersed information, put it into one place, educate one person, and they in turn educate their communities, which I think is an interesting actually in terms of you obviously have a framework, and although what's happening in Moycullen mightn't be the same what's happening in Gorey or wherever, the framework that the process you've implemented probably is, and you can use a platform like that to scale what you're doing too. But so yeah, that's how. And then overnight we were in 80 communities, and in the space of 8 months, still volunteer, it still is no money. We just raised funding, but we haven't got it in. And in our spare time, 17 other countries. So it scaled really, really quickly.
And do you think that, I mean, is this, because obviously there's something amazing about, I mean, as a Kerry person, to hear about the opportunities on Valentia Island is amazing, because it's somewhere that like, I would traditionally associate with people leaving because they can't get work.
Yeah.
And so there's something quite revolutionary about that idea of giving people the opportunity to get work in those places that might, but is there also something about changing the nature of communities in the sense that like, if your job doesn't require you being in a specific place at a specific time 5 days a week, that presumably also changes your ability to raise your family or be involved in a community group or be involved in, you know, local organizations or whatever it is. Like, is there something actually, it's not just about place, is it? It's also about like ways of working and the way of living in a community.
Yeah. So if you can take a job and you can have it anywhere, and then all of a sudden, you know, you don't have to commute and your income can stay locally, then that's where we really get interested. So we were speaking earlier on, some people want to move to an area because there's a really good place for a brunch on a Saturday. Some people want to move to an area because there's a kayaking club. There was a guy who was telling me he wanted to move to Connacht, but he was self-employed. But his daughter was really into tennis. And he's like, all these communities are shouting about quality of life. I just want a really good tennis court because I need to nurture that in her. You want proximity to the sea. I want proximity to the sea. I also want, like I know Westport, for instance, has a running club that goes out a couple of times a week, and even when it's dark you can run, and for me being able to run a 10k is important. And there are all of these things then that can come into our planning, that when employment is anywhere, what is it that helps you choose where you live? And there's a website called Gapologist, which was built by a guy who's just built it for himself, but you can search Ireland by, you know, multi-denominational schools, commuter times to train stations, whatever else it is. And I think that's the kind of stuff that we're looking at when we can equalise access to employment and there's freedom of movement of people. They'll decide based on the quality of life.
And
I
that
think
unleashes the talent that they have and so on. That actually brings me to Laoise. You are a lecturer also in NUIG in biomechanical engineering. And as Nuala pointed out, you were recently named Irish Researcher of the Year in 2019. And so obviously there's a certain amount of talent, your talent, but there's also something about the type of work that you do as a research scientist that involves bringing people together in a community, in the sense that some work can be done remotely, some work can be done in different places, some work also requires people to be brought together in a specific place together with specific equipment and specific resources and so on. And as a research scientist, obviously you need labs and you need a university environment and so on. But people from outside of the west of Ireland might be surprised that the kind of world-leading, cutting-edge research that you do is taking place in Galway. How do you, because you have, like I think Pat as well, spent time working abroad, as I did as a young academic as well. Lots of us like end up spending time abroad because of bigger universities and more access to money and so on. How do you convince the talent that we know is there to want to locate itself in somewhere like NUIG to build that kind of community?
Yeah, I guess there's two ways of attracting talent to places like NUIG. First of all, we unfortunately, and this was mentioned earlier on, we produce lots of talent all the time and the talent leaves. So they're a very valuable source of talent that we should be looking at attracting back to the west of Ireland. Is these, and you know, over the past 10 or 15 years there's been quite a lot of that. You know, we were producing in engineering 120 civil engineers in 2008, and then there was the crash in the economy and they all went abroad, went to say Abu Dhabi and Dubai and places like that. So they, to me, are the first and foremost group of talent that I think can be attracted back to the west of Ireland based on their love of the the west of Ireland and then their understanding of what it is like to live and work here and the importance of that. So they're one group. But of course, the west of Ireland should be very attractive for many other reasons. And we attract talent really on the basis of the size of the city, the size of the university, and the fact that the city in itself is quite diverse. So one of the good things about coming from a relatively small place is that diversity is present in a small place, and communication links are very strong. So, there's a lot of ability to talk to. So for us in Galway, and in my particular space, what is the diversity? It would be the links between the hospital, the medical device sectors, and the university, and the engineering, which is where I come from. So in a small city, you will have the opportunity to, first of all, train great people. Those great people get jobs in the medical device sector, and you continue to have that linkage to them. And equally, in the hospital environment, the hospital is quite close to the university, quite close to these medical device companies. So you can have an ecosystem where if you need expertise knowledge from one of the parties, that generally these people know each other or they've come across each other before, and it makes the opportunity to get those types of opinions very available to you. So I think in terms of when we try and sell and attract a talent to Galway that have not had any sort of emotional connection to the place before, it's really around the fact that this diverse, multidisciplinary, multicultural city has this huge multinational presence there. So we have a lot of med tech sector, we've a lot of computer science, data analytics going on there, small tech companies and big tech companies. And that's a real vibrant, and then the obvious part to this is what is it about the culture of the city that people might want to live in.
Yeah,
and that's a big selling point for us in Galway is place and this west of Ireland location.
Because the type of research that you do is on bones, and you might explain a little bit of that to the audience, but also the idea, like research science is very labor intensive, right? Like you need to have a lot of people working together, and the economies of scale can be quite important in terms of having a lot of research scientists and being able to have people at different career levels, postdoctoral people who are building careers and so on. And like in terms of the type of research that you do, is that idea of some kind of ecosystem behind it wherein you have companies, you have a health service, you have a research university that attracts people from all around the world. Like, is that something that, like, is that the reason why we're able to do something like that here rather than it being done in New York or it being done in Southampton where you've worked before?
Yeah. I mean, I guess in terms of building a research team and having them located here, it is a big selling point, the linkages to the medical device sector in particular and the hospital. And if you take the scale of the university relative to looking across the world at other universities, we are quite small, and many universities across the world would choose to focus on maybe 3 or 4 core areas. But we don't. We have a comprehensive university that has a breadth of different disciplines and activities in it. So in terms of think about what it does for a research community, you absolutely need the infrastructure, you need linkages to the medical device sector, you need links to the hospital for my type of research. I should answer the question of what I do. So our research is in an area called mechanobiology. And what that is the response of cells in the body to forces at its very essence. And where it's relevant to medical devices is obviously if someone gets a hip implant or a heart valve or a stent put in, those devices are fundamentally obviously fixing a problem, but applying force to the human body inside it. So how can we understand how the body senses and responds to that, and how can we actually design devices that are optimized for that? We also study a particular disease of bone called osteoporosis to see what is it about the biology of that disease that means that the cells are not sensing and responding to their physical forces in the way they should be. So to do that kind of research, you need multidisciplinarity. So in my group, I would have biologists, engineers. We interface with clinicians and surgeons and the medical device sector. So there's multiple parties, multiple expertise needed to do something like that. And you mentioned about the stages at which they're at. Yes, you have to recruit PhD students and train them. Postdocs, you need to be recruiting talent in from international labs and groups. And then even within our discipline and in our department, there is a breadth of international expertise that we bring in.
And attracting money is a key
Yeah,
element of that,
absolutely,
right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
recently
Yeah.
received a European research grant to further your research in Galway. I was particularly interested in your research because I recently had a metal implant in my wrist after breaking a number of bones last year, and I was wondering about this issue of funding, because it's actually something that is interesting about all three of your. You need it, but also you have managed to find ways of accessing it for projects that, if you had told people before any of them started what you were going to do, they said you were going to do a village plan for a small village or create a remote working platform that's going to find hundreds of jobs on Valentia Island, or that you're going to bring world-leading bone research to NUIG and create a research ecosystem. People might have thought that these were relatively fanciful ideas. None of them came from a sort of top-down government grant, but you have all found ways of accessing public funding, not in enormous amounts at the beginning, but you've had Irish Research Council funding. WeGrow has had funding from the Regional Development Fund and from other social enterprise fund as well, I think. And obviously you've had European research grant funding and Irish Research Council funding. Is there something interesting there about, when we were talking earlier at the beginning, when I was talking with Pat about the idea of communities taking it upon themselves, individuals taking it upon themselves to get the ball rolling, that's in some ways how you can best get involved with the authorities and the structures that are actually there? Because once you showed that the idea was there was money available to publicly invest in these good ideas, but that the ideas weren't just going to come out of thin air in Dublin to, out of a government department. They came from people on the ground having a good idea. Do you think that that's, when we're thinking about the ways that communities can take ownership of something but also exist within the existing structures and take advantage of the existing structures, like, is that what needs to be done? Is the idea needs to be there and then you pursue?
Yeah.
You think so, yeah?
So the Western Development Commission did 2 consultations last year, one in Sligo, one in Limerick, and they asked people, you voted with your phone, so completely independently as soon as you walked in, we've got £1 million, what do you want us to do with it? Do you want us to open up our own fund? Do you want to do remote working? Do you want to do whatever? They said, there is enough money out there, help us navigate it. Help us when a group of us are seeing something happening on the main street and we want to make change. How do we get together and go for that? I know for Grow Remote, we just raised $500,000. We got 20,000 from Social Entrepreneurs Ireland, and I asked somebody for advice because I was looking for money, but they actually just gave me advice, and they said, whatever you do, leverage the money. And we didn't spend a penny of it since that day. And I called up somebody else and I said, I've got 20,000, will you give me another 20? And they said yes. And I went, oh my God, should I have asked you for more? And he said, just keep going. So I did keep going, and then we got in a tiny bit more, and we started to get all these stakeholders like properly invested. But definitely, we were a year and a half old at that point. We were in multiple countries. We had all the processes set up, like we had it done, and then people were, oh, we'll fund you to do it. But we definitely had to do it ourselves first. But we weren't constricted by anything that we'd be constricted by if we were doing it, say, within the likes of the WDC. And Tomás Sheacon, who's the CEO of that, said it to me. He said, look, Tracey, you can get up and running an awful lot faster than we can, but we can help you sustain yourselves a lot better than you'd be able to do on your own.
It's about taking advantage of the different strengths that like a public agency or a startup like Grow Remote might have. And is there something interesting there about, because it's not just about funding, is it? There's, you said there about like you turn 20,000 into 100,000 into 500,000 into something. And Pat, you said earlier about like, you would have been happy with 20% of people in Moycullen participating. You probably would have thought that was great at the beginning, but it kind of got a snowball effect of its own in the sense that once people started to see, oh, there's something happening here, there's something important happening here, then they wanted to be part of it. And is there there's a snowball effect there of money, there's a snowball effect there of participation. And is the first step the most difficult step, is that you somehow have to create some bit of momentum? How do you do that? Like, does it have to be something that is highly localized or something that is an idea that people see, or is that something that we can actually change our mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think, people recognize good ideas, when they come along. And it's a case of, I suppose, the way that we did it, we just publicized it as much as we could. Now, we had money in the form of funding from the IRC at this point. But I don't think the people of Moycullen were that interested in who was funding this, and it wasn't much money at all, at all. But they weren't worried about that. They were just interested in the idea. But you're right. I mean, as much as funding begets funding, good ideas beget funding, and that funding begets more funding. So now the community of Moycullen are looking to draw down $500,000 for the purchase of a site for the development of a community centre, a direct result of a village plan, which would have been impossible to predict at the outset. So it's interesting. Just get the good ideas out there, and watch the take.
If you build it, they will come. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Alicia, when you were working in New York and in Southampton, right? And when you came back first to Galway, your position was funded, I think, by Science Foundation Ireland, was it? Obviously there has been a great growth in your career since that, but also a great growth in the research community around you in Galway. And do you think that there's a model there? Because universities, I would say this and you would say this as people, and perhaps say this as people who work in universities. Universities are communities themselves, but they are also part of communities, right? And you've explained to us how in NUIG, the type of research that you do has knock-on effects in the sense of the foreign direct investment in the medical devices sector, the employment that brings, the diversity that having a university in a city, in a region brings. I mean, is that something that, do we maybe need our university sector to be given the funding and the prioritization to be able to do that in other regions of the country as well, because they are great places for that snowball effect that we're talking about to take place, that then has a knock-on effect, even in the sense of somebody like Pat taking his research out into the community that he lives in, his wife is from, and that there is this kind of feedback that comes through having a vibrant university.
Yeah, so in terms of the funding question, right, so that there's funding, no doubt, is critical to being able to do the type of research that we do. But we've had to be very creative about how to get that funding. I mean, when I moved back to Ireland, I found myself ineligible for the national funding because I'd come back on this, what was seen to be kind of an attractor position, this Science Foundation Ireland funded position, that in itself deemed me ineligible for anything else, which was just crazy.
Yeah.
So, and I could have seen that as a limitation, but I just decided then I actually had gotten a European Research Council grant in 2010, and that was out of pure necessity. I was either going to find it from Europe or I was going to do no research, and I didn't come back to Ireland with the plan of winding down my research career. So that I suppose was a survival kind of strategy from my perspective. But it's very important for people to look to Europe for funding. So Europe, for me, has been absolutely the main source of funding and has changed my career completely. So I think communities can do that. There is a lot of European funding out there, and some of it will be very defined in what it's for, and other of it will be what's called blue sky funding, where you imagine what you're going to do, and that's the way I've been funded. It's been up to me completely to come up with what I propose to do, and there's no specific call or area that I'm fitting into. It's that, and Europe has that way of funding things, so they do think like that. Right now in Ireland we have a bit of a challenge in that because of the economy crash, the government were very smart. They started to drive research funding to more the applied end of the spectrum, right? So what does that mean? Funding was going to people who had maybe a technology that was about to spin out, or that had a medical device partner or any sort of industrial partner. And it kept funding in the ecosystem, so at least there was some funding at a time when people were saying, well, why would you fund research? That's not important. The government was smart at, or Science Foundation Ireland were saying, look, to the government, because research leads to jobs, research leads to startup companies, it leads to growth in the economy and training of bright people. The problem right now is that we've been doing that for a little bit too long. So our universities are at threat right now of not being able to come up with the next big ideas that can then lead to a spin-out company or a technology, or so, and equally not everything should be commercially focused. So, in the social sciences, it's very difficult right now for funding, because there's this idea about impact. And of course, but impact is important, right? And we can make an impact in terms of culture or social practices and social impact. And all of those qualify, but unfortunately the real driver of funding right now is in terms of economic benefit. And it was right, but it's now time for us to roll back. So the government absolutely should now, and the Irish Research Council actually are fantastic. They've spotted this issue and they funded my laureate award, which is really mapped perfectly onto this European Research Council Blue Sky funding model, which is that, again, that it doesn't have to have a very short-term impact. It doesn't have to be, it's about something. It could be a disease question. It could be, and some of those questions, if you think about asking, one of our projects is focused on bone metastasis. So how does cancer from a primary site get into the bone? What is it about the bone that is particularly attractive? That's what the Irish Research Council fund. And for us, that could be a 30-year journey for us to figure out what that is. And you can't fund that. Those questions would never start to get asked if you focus only on something that might have a 5 to 10 year
I think
impact.
that's a fascinating question because, obviously, I'm a historian, and so I totally agree with what you say about not everything has to be commercial to have an impact, and impact can come in lots of different forms. And we work very slowly as historians as well, so we also need these projects. We don't need nearly as much money as it takes to do medical research, but we need time. And I thought that's really a great point to link back to something that Pat said about what people in Moycullen thought was important, which was community. It was something that was almost intangible in some ways, in the same way that the next great research question or the next great idea or the next great employer or the next great way of living or whatever is not necessarily something that we can envisage in advance. And I wonder if, to finish off, to think about, because we've been talking about the last 100 years, and Jim was talking about the way that local communities in some ways have been failed by certain amounts of centralisation and stuff. And we've had 3 great examples here of the way that people can create communities and interesting ideas that look to the future in a positive way, that then create a sense of their own momentum. I mean, Moycullen was Moycullen 2030. If we think about Moycullen 2040 or Ballina 2050, what kind of a future do you guys think is possible in the west of Ireland? Do you think that, are you optimistic? Do you think that we will have a place where communities envisage their futures and people feel engaged and GAA teams can field at all the levels from minor up to intermediate? Or are we going to be sitting here talking about, in 2050, talking about the same type of issues?
Well, probably. No.
Let's try and be optimistic.
No, to be optimistic.
Yeah.
No, to be optimistic, I think, we're 100 years old as a country. We made, I wouldn't say a mistake, but we made a conscious effort in the 1970s to consider development as economic. Okay, so that was it. It was all about the economy. And the way that we did that then was through industrialization by invitation. So we bought in FDI and we played that card. And we played that card extremely well, as it turned out. And, Leisha talked about the presence of FDI around Ireland being important for, pushing Ireland onto a global stage. 9 of the top 10 tech companies are here in Ireland. But I think as we embrace on the 2nd century, it's time to start trusting in ourselves now, to say that, well, we're past the era of industrialization. There are new work practices that are coming about that, as we push into an information economy, that have a very different kind of geography to them in terms of how they embed themselves in space. So Valentia Island having that amount of jobs is signatory of this kind of move. And it's time that, that Ireland grew up and trusted in itself and its people for the kind of innovation that we know is latent in us, in the form of the culture that we have, we're the envy of countries across the world, and it's time to do that. And as the focus moves more away from the economic imperative to issues like quality of life, I think then places like the west of Ireland open up as these areas of opportunity where this is a resource that we have in spades.
I think that's a great way to finish, because I think that's something that all of us who grew up in the west of Ireland think, that we have this amazing place that we come from, this place that we call home, and that there is something special about the idea that we can imagine a future in which we think of our own ideas and our own ways of doing things that will imagine a new future. And so thank you all for sharing
Thank
us the 3 ways that you've done that, and hopefully you will all have found inspiration, and we'll be hearing about 2040 plans from all different parts of Mayo and people doing remote working and everything else. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.